conflict, climate change, hunger, homelessness, hopelessness. As a result of over 130 million people being displaced seeking refuge somewhere else where their humanity can be recognized. While the 1951 Refugee Convention presents the right of asylum seekers to legally seek asylum in their country of presence without fear of removal, cases in the Middle East, the UK, Denmark, and across the world have attempted to send these vulnerable people to third countries. This brings us to the issues we are trying to confront today. Thank you for joining us for our special program, The Roots of a Nation to Forced Migration. I'm your host, Muhammad Ali. This presentation comes by the way of and sponsorship of the Interfaith G20, US for UNHCR, and Islamic Relief USA. Today, we are joined by special guests and experts to address these topics. With us, we have Aliyah Boltake, founder and attorney of the Boltake Law Group, Harissa Dada, program officer with the International Rescue Committee, Anna Green, senior protection officer, UNHCR, Cynthia Lang, senior counsel with Fragment, Dr. Nabil El-Tikriti, professor of Middle East history with the University of Mary Washington. So let's get after it. I want to first come to Anna Green with the UNHCR, who's going to give us a global, broader context on the landscape of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, terms that are often used interchangeably, but have distinct meanings. So, Anna, give us the global context of what refugees are experiencing, who they are, who asylum seekers are, and migrants. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I hope my presentation will project in a moment, but I am going to speak a little bit about the origins of the global refugee protection system that we have today, look at some of the current global trends, and then really try to introduce a few of the biggest contemporary challenges that my agency, the UN Refugee Agency, and many of our partners are witnessing today, working in the field. So we can advance to the next slide. Thank you. So the Office of the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, was established really in the wake of World War II. And what we saw before the creation of the United Nations was that sanctuary for people who were escaping persecution or armed conflict was often provided by societies across many different faith traditions across the world. But those societies really provided protection or denied protection as individual sovereign states, mostly based on their own considerations of geopolitical advantage, of kinship they felt with the refugees who might be fleeing, or in some cases, economic interest. And with the advent of the First and Second World Wars, the international community, as you know, the League of Nations came into being and then the UN was established, really started to think about refugees differently in terms of, you know, really trying to create a multilateral framework and a treaty framework in specific that would create obligations to protect people fleeing persecution specifically, but oftentimes in the context of armed conflict. So you really see the creation of my agency in 1950, and the signing by many of the UN member states onto the treaty in 1951 as sort of the beginning of our modern framework, which creates a treaty basis for the protection of these most vulnerable people. Next slide. You can see that 149 UN members are now parties either to the 1951 Convention or the 1967 Protocol, or in many cases, both of those instruments. And the 1951 Convention created a multilateral framework that only applied to European refugees in the context of World War II, whereas the 1967 Protocol, those who signed that protocol expanded their treaty obligations to include any refugee from any part of the world. You can see that the vast majority of the world, with some selected states, mainly in South and Southeast Asia, as well as I believe Eritrea, Libya, and Cuba, who are not signatories, but we do have a pretty wide uptake on treaty ratification. Now, this is a treaty that doesn't have enforcement mechanisms the way that one might imagine. It really does rely on states to incorporate their obligations into their domestic law and then apply that law. And UNHCR's role is both as an operational agency to support states, to help channel other states' funding to those states for their protection and support for refugees, as well as obviously the main body that exercises diplomacy and advocacy, guidance, training, and in some occasions, even engaging in litigation to try to support, encourage, and sometimes compel states to implement their obligations for refugees that are in their territory. I will just say, though, this is a regime that really it is framed and built around the notion of multilateral and international cooperation. Next slide. There are currently over 110 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Most of those are under UNHCR's mandate, but this includes 30.5 million refugees under UNHCR's mandate, an additional 5.9 million Palestinian refugees under the mandate of a different agency, the UN Relief Works Agency, as well as many millions of IDPs, people who are displaced inside their own country, and many more asylum seekers, either on the move or waiting in asylum countries for a determination of their status. Now, 52% of this total, this total of the refugee total of the 30.5 came from only 3 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And so we really do see that as a result. You see that the vast majority of the refugees are living in neighboring countries. Although we do have Syrian, Afghani, and Ukrainian refugees arriving to borders beyond their own regions, the vast majority of refugees of these 3 nationalities, as well as other nationalities, Sudanese, Venezuelans, Syrians, Rohingya, are by and large being hosted in countries that are adjacent to their own. Next slide. The next slide demonstrates this reality in that, a very large percentage of the refugees today are in one of 5 countries. Lebanon is also notable in that it is the largest per capita hosting country. It doesn't have the same volume as some of the other countries, but due to its small size, it is considered to be one of the principal host countries in the world for refugees. And the reason I like to emphasize this is just to emphasize the importance of responsibility sharing, because some of these countries have been hosting refugees for a very long time in very high numbers, and really do depend on the support of the international community and responsibility sharing mechanisms such as resettlement to third countries. Next slide. So when the treaty regime and the international framework for the protection of refugees, which is shown on the next slide, really does rely on three distinct solutions for refugees, because the hope is that someone would not be a refugee for the rest of their life, that they would eventually either be able to return home voluntarily through voluntary repatriation, or they would be able to locally integrate and become a permanent resident, and ideally also a citizen of the country that is their host, or they would be welcomed in a third country who accepts them on a permanent resettlement. And so this is really the framework around which the UN Refugee Agency works when we think about how to solve the plight of the people under our care. I will say the average length of time in displacement is pretty much close to 2 decades for most refugees. When I first started working with UNHCR in the late 90s, I had the privilege of being part of a succession of very successful voluntary repatriation movements where hundreds of thousands of people were able to return home in safety with support, with integration help, and to start their lives back up in their home countries. But that period of voluntary repatriation seems to have dissipated in the last 20 years, and there are very, very few options for people to safely return home given the current conflicts from which they've fled. In 2023, UNHCR identified over 2.4 million refugees who were most in need of resettlement to a third country. So there are refugees all over the world that could certainly benefit from resettlement, but because of the limited number of slots that are available in third countries, we normally identify the numbers who are most in need of that solution, whether it's because of medical needs or psychosocial needs or family reunification needs or physical protection needs. And we had 2.4 million people identified last year, yet less than 100,000 of them were able to actually travel to a third country. So this is a very, very important life-saving mechanism, but it is unfortunately, it only meets the needs of the tiniest sliver of the people who most need it. Next slide. I'm going to end the presentation with 3 slides that just talk through contemporary challenges. The first one I just mentioned, that we are really facing many, many protracted crises with very dim prospects for the populations affected to voluntarily return in the foreseeable future. Dozens of crises which have no end in sight. And this leads to the second challenge, which that the largest host countries, mostly neighboring the countries where refugees have fled, really have growing pressures, the pressures related with the economy post-COVID, the political pressures, the pressures on their societies writ large. And of course, we've all seen across the globe pressures relate on the refugees themselves related to xenophobia. The third contemporary challenge I also just mentioned is that third country resettlement solutions are quite limited. And in fact, 82% of all refugees who were settled last year were received in only 3 countries, the US, Canada, and Australia. There are many other countries, about 20 other countries that do participate, but the number of opportunities that they offer are quite limited. And so this is also a big challenge that we face in trying to meet the needs. Next slide. We also see really increasingly fragile situations of refugees in the first host country. Sometimes after only 5 years, their situation becomes extremely fragile. Sometimes it becomes fragile only after 10 years, etc. And what we're seeing now is that many refugees who have been for a short time or even a long time in their first host countries of asylum are moving onwards in search of stability. And that leads to the next challenge, which is that we really see a growing complexity of mixed migration movements. So we see refugees who fled persecution or conflict, who are increasingly using the same migratory channels as migrants are. Migrants who may be leaving for extreme poverty or due to economic conditions, who don't necessarily qualify for refugee protection, but are also migrating in search of a better life. And this mixing of the two populations, and I believe my colleague Cynthia will be speaking about this more in the Western Hem context, makes it even harder to identify refugees and ensure that the specific rights that they should enjoy under this international treaty regime are met. And the other obvious outtake on this is that in these mixed movements, refugees are increasingly exposed to extraordinarily dangerous conditions in maritime movements and in journeys through land. So my final slide, I will just mention that as refugees are moving increasingly towards third countries in these mixed migration movements, on the next slide, we do see that in the developed asylum countries, asylum systems are becoming increasingly strained. Individualized asylum systems, which involve, obviously a tremendous amount of resources to identify, give access to due process, and that adjudicate these claims, are really under tremendous strain right now. It's not only here in the US. We often talk about the 2 million people in asylum backlog here, but around the world, we are seeing asylum systems in high income and middle income countries that are under increasing strain. And this chart sort of shows the evolution of the number of individualized asylum claims in backlog. So I believe that this probably gives you the very big picture, and I'm going to pass off to my esteemed colleague Cynthia to dig a little bit deeper and talk about the specific circumstances in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for giving us that sky point of view of the global context on the landscape of refugees. Before I pass it over to Cynthia, for those who have burning questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If time permits, we will try to thread them or integrate them in, most likely at the end. And now I would like to introduce Cynthia to you, who's going to talk more about refugees, migrants, and asylees from a regional point of view. Cynthia?
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you, Anna. UNHCR is a wonderful organization. We all rely on the data that it produces for our analysis, and I'm going to use a lot of the data for my brief discussion today. Anna's explanation of the history and basis of refugee law was really helpful. Let's go to slide 2. As Anna explained, the definition of refugee was defined in the Refugee Convention of 1951. And we often hear this term used inappropriately by the news media. And it's important for this discussion to have a clear definition because there are certain legal benefits that go to people who fit this definition of refugee, and everyone else falls a little bit outside of that. Let's go to the next slide. So there's 5 elements that qualify as a refugee. And each country that administers this makes those determinations. So those determinations can vary depending on the country that someone's seeking refuge in. Depending on the laws and rules of that country, there can be various interpretations of each of the elements, and there's vastly different procedures to apply for refugee status. And one point to make about this definition is, let's go through it really quickly. You have to have a well-founded fear. You have to be unwilling or unable to return to your country of nationality. So one issue right off is you have to be outside of your country of nationality. We will learn that there's many internally displaced people within their country. They immediately don't meet the definition of refugee. And also they have to have a well-founded fear of persecution. Already people that may be fleeing climate disasters, things like that, may not fit into that category. And it has to be perpetrated by the government or an entity that the government cannot or will not control. Again, very limiting because you have to prove these very limited types of persecution. And it has to be on account of or because of, there has to be a nexus with one of the 5 protected grounds, because of their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or because of their membership in a particular group. Now, maybe at the end of World War II, that met the definition of a lot of the persecution we saw there. But we see today, so many decades later, that people are displaced for reasons that may not meet this definition. So it's one thing to consider as we go through our discussion today of migrants, refugees. Let's go to the next slide. There's other terms that are often used in the media and by people who work in this area that aren't necessarily defined by that UN Convention on Refugees. You saw from the slides that Anna showed earlier that UNHCR does use some of these definitions. And just briefly, migrant is somebody who's leaves their country and going to another country. Now, migrants may be refugees, they may not be. Those definitions may overlap. Somebody who's stateless is someone who doesn't have a nationality recognized by any country. And stateless persons are subject to quite a bit of problems. They don't have documents. They can't get documents. We've seen some of this in this hemisphere in Nicaragua, where Nicaragua has taken citizenship away from groups of people, and now they've become stateless and don't have anywhere to be. Asylum seekers are usually people who fled from their own country due to fear of persecution, and they've applied for a legal or physical protection. Now, in the US, there's a specific way asylum is sought. In other countries, there's different protocols. Some of the other speakers on this call will address a little bit about the difference between that in the United States, because in the US, asylum seekers are typically in the country, refugees are outside of the country before as they apply for this. And then internationally displaced person is somebody who is living internally displaced person who's somebody who's living inside the borders of their own country, but they're unable to safely live in their own region or home or country. And so that creates a lot of different definitions. Sometimes they're refugees, sometimes they're not. Let's go to the next slide. We wanted to explore the Americas as a subsection of the world. It's a significant region for a couple of reasons. One is because of its proximity to the US, which is often the target country many migrants head to, but also it's kind of a homogeneous region. And it has never really been a destination country for refugees. What we've seen lately is a huge increase in the Western Hemisphere, seeing large increases of asylum seekers. The data here was even before COVID, and it's grown exponentially since. In 2024, the region's forcibly displaced and stateless population is expected to grow to 25 million, having almost doubled since this chart was put together. And there's tremendous violence, insecurity, inequality, persecution, and human rights violations that go unresolved. Right now, Colombia is the country hosting the second largest number of refugees, which includes 2.5 million Venezuelans. We don't hear about that so much in the United States. Population movements continue throughout the Americas with increased movement towards Central America, Mexico, and ultimately the US. UNHCR serves over 7 million internally displaced people in Central America. And across the region, there's immediate needs for life-saving assistance, survival, emergency shelter, and we're just witnessing this unprecedented surge in irregular migration. Now, you may hear the word unprecedented a lot because it continues to grow exponentially in numbers we have just never seen in this region. And women and children are the most vulnerable. Let's go to the next slide. You've all probably heard of the Darien Gap. And the Darien Gap serves as a stark illustration of the perils faced by those in pursuit of refuge. There are people throughout Latin America, but people throughout the whole world. Last year set records where over 520,000 migrants braved what was, previously a very stark jungle that nobody really could get through. It has now become a well-worn, treacherous path, more than doubling the number from just the year before, and it's expected to increase exponentially. And it should be clear that these individuals are really fleeing hardship to put themselves through that. In interviewing people that have gone through there are dead bodies strewn along the way. There's people that are vulnerable and subject to human trafficking and abuse. And people come from all over the world. It's extraordinary the number of countries that are represented there. Children and teenagers now constitute an astonishing 22% of those migratory flows. Let's go to the next slide. Probably one of the biggest difficulties that we're seeing is the criminal organizations are starting to take over this irregular migration path. And it's increasingly influenced by the gravity of these criminal organizations taking over a lot of this. Organized crime thrives and exacerbates this crisis. Drug cartels and trafficking syndicates have broadened their traditional, well-established business to include human smuggling, human trafficking as a side venture, but it's proven to be very lucrative side venture because they're not only exploiting desperate people, they're also reaping vast profits estimated at between 7 and 13 billion annually in the Americas alone. Human smuggling has morphed into one of the most lucrative industries for crime groups, but of course less than drugs, but it's growing fast. Its influence is a catalyst for an array of human rights violations that include murder, sexual assault, extortion, and further destabilizing the region that the individual nations are striving against the tide. Colombia, Panama, Chile, and Costa Rica, and others have taken commendable steps, and yet the strain on their resources and their societies continue to mount. These countries are now home to over 20% of this hemisphere's migrants, and they're reaching a tipping point. Most of the migrants and refugees moving through Costa Rica and Panama are headed for the United States, which has also experienced an influx of 7.5 million irregular migrants at its southern border. It's a staggering number. The role being played by organized criminals who are making huge sums of money and preying on vulnerable people can't be underestimated. And what the future holds is staggering if we don't solve these problems. Let's go to the next slide. Just really quickly, I want to say that Venezuela has been one of the greatest contributors to these migration issues in the Americas. Millions and millions of people have traveled outside of Venezuela. And the regime in Venezuela has committed arbitrary, unlawful killings. The State Department reports from the US have documented the reasons for all this. But in addition, they've allowed the establishment of criminal cartels and organizations that are highly tolerated by the government. Next slide. Central America has experienced really also tremendous amount of influx. While it doesn't represent the same number as some of the other countries, for the small countries that are there, it's an incredible burden to play. Let's go to the last slide. And I just want to explore the solutions that we will invite questions on, but it's what everybody's looking for. As a person of faith, and a lot of us here are people of faith and part of faith-based organizations, I find there's very well-meaning people and organizations that are working hard to ensure that people fleeing persecution, as well as other displaced migrants, will have solutions. Right now, the response from the region's countries have been fragmented and insufficient against the scale and sophistication of criminal enterprises and, frankly, just the volume of people coming through. Law enforcement responses are still siloed in many of the national boundaries. And we stand at a criminal juncture where now law enforcement is being usurped by criminal gangs to also participate. And so it's very difficult. There are, human rights enshrined within the pillars of the UN and other organizations that we must galvanize to address this crisis. But there are some steps being taken in the right direction. There are groups coming together. In the Summit of the Americas that was held in Los Angeles in June 2022, there was a Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection that was the first agreement to include so many countries from the Western Hemisphere. And importantly, it involved the US and Canada, and signatory countries committed to expand the legal pathways and support migration. And there has been some of that. The OAS, as a hemispheric organization, is working on multilateral organizations. And that coordination can help to stop some of that. My last point, though, is that there's a huge funding gap. The funding that's needed to be able to adequately address this is missing from most organizations that are on this call, from most countries that are involved in this. And that is something that has to be addressed to be able to get to a solution. Thank you so much, Mohammed.
Thank you, Cynthia. Cynthia, Cynthia spoke to length about the influx and then the volume of migrants and those seeking refuge at the southern border. So that takes me to you, Aaliyah. How has the safe third country agreement impacted the situation at the southern border, the agreement which was made between the United States and Canada? Do you see this as an improvement or a setback to the immigration process? Aaliyah?
I was muted. So I think that the first thing that we have to answer is what is this agreement and what does it mean for asylees? Because really, this is an agreement that affects asylees more so than it does refugees, as Cynthia explained the difference between the two. So basically, under this agreement, refugees, or I mean, asylees basically are required to request protection in the first safe country they arrive in. So this does affect the northern border, which is the United States and Canada, but it does also affect the southern border in many ways. So unfortunately, the safe third country concept is not a concept that's really working. It would work if the countries that were considered safe countries were capable of accepting asylees and they had the infrastructure to support that. But in the southern border, countries like Guatemala, Mexico, El Salvador, which are mainly the countries that people are fleeing from, they just don't have the capability of absorbing the large numbers of asylees that are coming through, and those that are being returned from the southern border. Additionally, as Cynthia mentioned, because of this this policy, many of those people, because they're being forced to return back to those third safe countries, are being faced with threats from gangs, criminal groups, extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking. And as a person who's a practitioner, I tend to see this firsthand. So I have, my clients coming to me and telling me, yes, I was kidnapped for 3 months. My family was requested to ransom me out. Sexual violence, especially, because coming through the border, most of the people who are coming through is children, women. And so they're particularly vulnerable to this violence and exploitation. And also it's feeding into the human trafficking issue. So I believe, under the Trump administration, there was a Title 42 policy. We saw that a lot of these returning back policies or staying in Mexico policies, they weren't working. And they were causing people to be subject to difficult situations, further violence, criminal groups, like that. So I believe that it's not something that's, because those countries, if they were capable of actually accepting asylees and having safe situations for them, then yes, it would work. But unfortunately, there really isn't that available to asylees there. And many of the things that people are fleeing from, for example, if a person is fleeing from domestic violence, it's very easy for their partner to travel through to go to Guatemala or to travel through, go to Mexico and get them and bring them back. So it's not feasible for them to stay, and so they don't want to stay there. And I don't think that it's a practical policy that would be helpful to people in South and Central America.
Thank you, Leah. Various sources have pulled the alarm about migrants coming from across the world, countries and across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, seek asylum through the southern border. How prevalent of an issue is this, and do you foresee this being a bigger issue to come in the future?
So, I mean, I think we have to look at why are the reasons, why is there an uptick of migrants, coming from other countries? The United States historically, most recently has seen most migrants or asylees coming from South and Central America. But more recently, we have seen, asylees coming from Africa, Asia, Middle East, Europe. And I think that a lot of the reason that those things are happening is some things of what mentioned Anna as well as Cynthia, that there's restrictions being made in the other countries that were accepting asylees. And they're not really accepting asylees as much as they would in the past. There's limited numbers. And so the countries, as mentioned before, USA, Australia, Canada, those are the countries that are able to accept the asylees and have a more broader, open asylum program where people can come through the border. But I think, so when we see, people come to the United States or seek asylum for various reasons. But a lot of time, people from Africa, South Asia, Middle East, they're coming because of conflict or, situations that are occurring. Europe, we saw Ukrainian refugees and asylees coming from there, Russia. A lot of people don't think that asylees are coming from Europe, but they are, especially, the former Soviet Union countries. There's a lot of corruption there. And I'm seeing, I see myself personally an uptick in political asylees coming from those countries for those reasons, specifically, not so much economic reasons, but actual political reasons. So, yes, we are seeing an increase in the numbers. There's several humanitarian concerns. So all of those reasons are reasons why people are further coming to the United States. But the way that it's affecting the United States is that, the US has a huge backlog in the immigration courts as well as the asylum offices. At this point, there's about more than 3 million cases that are backlogged in the immigration court system. Although the courts have hired more judges and increased courts, there is still a backlog. So what this causes is it causes a huge burden on the immigration system. And, people who are seeking asylum or seeking some type of protection, in the United States have a harder time gaining that assistance or gaining that protection because of just the backlog. So in the courts itself, people may be waiting years in order to have a hearing where they can present their case. In the asylum office as well, it's very standard to have your case pending for over 6 years, 5 to 6 years, if not more. Waiting for just an interview, if not a decision on the case. Immigration is unfortunately, it's very political. So the changes that happen with the immigration system in the United States are often affected by who's in the office at that time or political opinion at that time. And a lot of those things can also drive asylees to be coming to the United States. The United States is trying more recently, and specifically there's been what's called a Doyle memo. So I know that they're trying to address the backlogs into at least the immigration court system, where they're looking at people who are applying for asylum or some type of status, in the immigration courts, as far as whether they're a priority or not. And so, they're offering prosecutorial discretion to migrants or those who they feel are not necessarily a priority for removal from the United States. Many of those people, the effect of that, though, is yes, it's taking cases out of the immigration court system, but it is placing those cases often back into the asylum office, which is increasing the burden there, which I believe will cause people to have to wait longer even for their cases. So I believe that, yes, there is an increase in people coming from countries outside of Central and South America. But this is as a result of all the conflicts that are occurring outside of the United States. And it's something that I don't believe is going to change. I believe that as we can see, there's an increase in global conflicts. And as long as the European countries are limiting, or other countries outside the US, Australia, and Canada are limiting the inclusion of asylees to their countries, the US and all of the other countries are going to see an increase in asylees coming through South and Central America and traveling that way to the southern border.
Thank you, Leah. As we heard from Leah, Dr. Nabil, the Middle East is no exception to those needing their humanity recognized who are seeking refuge. They are also pouring through southern border. You're an expert on Middle East history. Given the historical context of the situation in Palestine, we all see the ravaging situation there, and it's on the hearts and minds of everybody across the world. What makes the current climate of the unfolding circumstances any different now? What might you offer as a common sense, permanent, and sustainable solution to the issue at hand? I know that's probably the billion-dollar question, but we brought you because we believe you have a good answer for it.
I think somebody should mute because we're getting an echo. Just thought I'd point that out. All right, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the other panelists' inputs. I'll just say that this is a very different type of discussion than refugee policy, in the sense that it is political and regional. And the situation in Gaza at the moment is off the charts. It's setting records in certain respects. And whether or not it's technically a legal genocide is something that will be debated for many years. I personally think it is, but I would also argue that it is an acceleration of a long-term genocide, not necessarily something that just started 4 or 5 months ago. In terms of the region as a whole, it has seen instability as far as I can remember. And my personal professional story starts in 1991 with the Gulf War. And I've been watching the region ever since 1991, in effect, get worse and worse and worse, and jump from crisis to crisis, with the numbers progressively getting worse as well. So going back to 1991, there was something like 750,000 Palestinians. Well, no, it wasn't that high, but several thousand, tens of thousands of Palestinians who left Kuwait and then found their way to Jordan. And for Jordan, this was something like the 3rd out of 6 refugee waves over something like a 50-year period. And they dealt with it, and they were able to deal with it. And then it just kept happening again. So it happened with Iraq. It then happened with Syria, most notably, after 2011, 2012. And then it most recently is happening with Gaza. What I've noticed over the last 30 years of my professional time in the field, so I come from more of a field perspective than a policy perspective, is that the numbers of displaced and all those multiple definitions, asylum seekers, refugees, displaced, mixed migrants with multiple reasons to move, the numbers have gone from what I remember being something like 30 million worldwide in around 2008 to now being said to be 130 million. And that is something like 1 in 65 human beings, if I get my numbers correct on overall population. And it is swamping not only the asylum systems in the countries that have asylum systems, it's swamping other factors in countries that don't have such well-established systems. And the overall global system is at a breaking point. What I've also noticed over the years is that hostility against those who move has increased exponentially. It was something that was relatively accepted in US and European societies, I would say up until about 2015, when there was a clear break after the mass migration of those through Turkey and the Mediterranean into Europe following the breakdown of Syria. And since that time, the hostility has grown also off the charts, as much as the numbers coming. And it has become a huge political football, not just in the US, but also in Europe. And I would argue that there's a right-wing movement in both context, the US and Europe, they coordinate with each other, and they're using the increase in asylum seeking and the increase in movements of populations as a domestic political football. And we've all seen that, and it is getting more and more desperate. Now, taking it as a long-term view, I don't actually see an easy situation for the Palestinians in the short term. In the longer term, what I think almost has to happen is a complete redefinition of the state of Israel that will allow, well, actually you have one of two choices. You could, in effect, separate and do a genuine two-state solution with genuine sovereignty over separate pieces of land, or you can have a one-state solution with the reintegration of the populations. Whether that ever happens has a lot to do with what happens in Washington. In the short term, I'm not remotely optimistic that either is going to happen, but one of those two has to eventually happen, or you're looking at straight up genocide. And there's genocides that have come before, there's genocides that will come later, and this will just in the long view just be another one. I think I'll stop at that point for that question anyway.
Longevity, you mentioned two-state solution or one-state solution. Considering the human condition, what do you think would be most beneficial for all to live a safe and prosperous life?
The way it appears from 2024, it would almost, it argues for a two-state solution with an equal, maybe not equal, but a division of territory and full sovereignty and full state rights. It cannot be one of these sort of fudging scenarios where one population is valued more than the other population and gets all of the support of the global system, and the other population is at most allowed to live but not allowed to thrive. That is not a kind of situation that can continue into the future as a stable situation. If it's going to be stable, it has to be resolved. And one of the ways to resolve it is to say, that territory is yours, you have full sovereignty over it, and this territory is ours, we have full sovereignty over this. That has never been the policy agenda of Washington in reality, but it has to become the policy agenda looking forward.
You know, given the dangers that we see and the catastrophic human loss, the destruction of institutions and beyond, there is a debate. Should Palestinians leave and attempt to return, or should they stay with the hopes that the humanitarian situation will improve? What do you say?
I cannot and should not speak for any Palestinian parent trying to protect their own family. If they choose to leave in any scenario, whether they're paying $25,000 to get the family through Egypt and then on to Europe, or whether they don't have those kinds of means and they simply go through a tunnel into Sinai and hope for the best, which is not currently possible, but it might become possible in the near future, I cannot speak for them. I cannot tell them, you must stay to maintain a Palestinian presence in historical Palestine, or you must leave because it's going to resolve the situation. None of us have the right to tell that to any Palestinian parent. However, objectively speaking, if the population as a whole is forced to cross into Sinai, several things then become clear. One is it crosses a legal threshold that I believe makes the genocide case even stronger, and I mean that in the short term, because you will have eliminated the presence of Palestinians within historic Palestine. And two, it may very well unravel the regional security architecture. As Egypt has said, that would be a red line. And at that point, either the Egyptian government reacts by, in one scenario, completely ending the Camp David Accords, or an enterprising colonel steps up, pushes the current government aside, and then brings about that reality. And then looking beyond just Egypt and Israel-Palestine, you also have the high potential of it spreading to Lebanon, and then beyond Lebanon to several other countries in the region. And if that security architecture breaks down, then all bets are off. And what is going on today in terms of asylum seeking will then be dwarfed by what comes in the future, because then you're talking several million more asylum seekers just from that region alone.
It seems that whatever crisis, humanitarian issue that's pervading the news at the moment in time makes another one that was just very recent, a foregone conclusion. I believe you spent some time in Ethiopia, and we shouldn't forget about what's going on in Tigray. And to their neighbor in Sudan, they obviously have an ongoing conflict and humanitarian crisis. What do you say? What are your thoughts about what's going on in the region? What do you think is going to continue to happen in Ethiopia with the situation in Tigray, considering everything else that's going on with the neighbors and within the region?
Speaking generally, I'll point out a couple of things. One is that the scale of what's going on in Sudan is even bigger than what's going on in Gaza in terms of numbers and in terms of territory. And it's not getting the attention that Gaza is getting for many reasons. And what is likely to happen in Sudan in the short term is not improvement. Ethiopia and Eritrea might be winding down. They had a terrible series of death, well, mass killings and whatnot a couple of years back, but it might be winding down. I'm not certain. In the long view, though, I think the situation for Africa might be a little bit more optimistic than the situation for the Middle East, only because of factors to do with the environment. And so in the very long view, there are some who are saying that Africa in something like 20, 30 years might be the most wealthy continent of them all, because their natural resource exploitation is behind all the others, and they still have natural resources. So I'm actually less worried about sub-Saharan Africa than I am about the Middle East, because in the Middle East, some territories are said to be becoming uninhabitable, like Iraq and like southern Iran, going into the future. So there's nothing in the short term to be optimistic about, but there might be something in the long term. And a final point regarding refugee policy from the global north is, up until now, they've tried to externalize the issue as much as they can. That's, for example, the UK having asylum seekers sent to Rwanda, which hasn't happened yet, but they're looking into it, or the US trying to have everyone seek asylum before crossing the border in Mexico or Canada. And these externalization policies are not likely to succeed in the long term. And I'll close with that.
Thank you. You mentioned, you spoke to the issue about the coverage in Sudan. What are you at Sudan and Ethiopia? What do you attribute to that? You said there were many reasons. What would you attribute to why it's not getting deserved coverage, if you will?
Well, I think it's, for whatever reason, our own media market and that of Europe as well is much more concerned with what happens in Israel-Palestine than they are concerned about what happens in Sudan. Why that is a long story that I don't know that I need to get into, but it's a fairly obvious point that one crisis is attracting a huge amount of attention and also is setting a lot of records, whereas the other crisis, even though it is larger in scale, is not setting the same kinds of records and is not attracting the same level of attention from the global north.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nabil. It looks like we may have lost Parissa. I don't see her on with us at the moment. I do want to come back to Anna for a moment. Dr. Nabil, stated, and we've heard earlier about the third country laws and bans that are going on in Europe. In 2023, Denmark stated it wasn't promoting a zero asylum policy. Rather, it would only accept asylum seekers through an official channel, the UN resettlement system. UNHCR reported that Denmark only accepted 250 refugees over the past 3 years through the UN. Why would Denmark take this position or approach? And I'll just mention, I believe of a majority of those refugees, if I'm not mistaken, were Syrian. And I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Mohammed. So I am not really in a position to speak directly to the situation in Denmark. I know that there is a tremendous amount of debate happening right now in the European Union as they try to negotiate an EU pact around asylum. And that is not an area of my expertise. I work on Western Hemisphere, but I will just say that it is becoming increasingly common, as Dr. Nabil also mentioned, that states are trying to recur to restricting access to territorial asylum to people who spontaneously arrive and ask asylum, and are looking to create more predictable means to provide protection. And in the context that I know the best, which is the Western Hemisphere, the US government has, for example, including through the processes that led to the LA Declaration, which I believe Cynthia mentioned, has been trying to create more lawful channels for actual refugees who have already fled their country to arrive to the US through the resettlement program. Now, UNHCR has been fully a partner with the US government in the creation of more innovative and more rapid resettlement processes to help people from the Western Hemisphere in particular reach safety in the United States. But we have always maintained that this system, while it's important and it may provide an alternative for many, many people to a very dangerous journey through the Darien Gap or through the desert or across the Rio Grande, it is still not a substitute for those who do arrive and who do ask for territorial asylum. So around the world, we obviously continue to advocate for states to respect the principle of non-refoulement for those who arise at their borders. And it really, in many, many cases, is a question of strengthening the capacities and the resources that are at the disposal of governments to make that determination when people come to the border. There is a very complex group of people coming to the border of many, many different nationalities, some with international protection needs and some that do not have international protection needs. As Cynthia was explaining, there are only certain people fleeing for certain reasons that qualify for refugee protection. And so it really does require the sufficient amount of resources to make those complex determinations and make sure that those who arrive to the border and do need access to the asylum procedure have access to that procedure. So that is not to say that massive scale up of lawful pathways is the wrong way to go. I personally believe that you need to do both. You need to strengthen territorial asylum, and you also need to provide more lawful pathways. I think these two things are complementary. They're not they're an and, not an and or. But I do think that it will be difficult to meet all of the needs through lawful pathways. And so we have to continue to strengthen access to territorial asylum at borders, whether it's in Denmark or in the United States or in Brazil or in Bangladesh. Back to you, Mohammed.
Thank you. So we do have Parissa with us now, which is great. So I'm going to shift over to her. Parissa, from the nations that the IRC operates in, from your experience, how have host communities received refugees and or asylum seekers?
Thank you. I'm going to try to make mine quick. So I was on the whole time, unfortunately. I was not on the panel view. That's why nobody could see me. But just really quick. So International Rescue Committee and other humanitarian organizations like mine, we basically work in the humanitarian aspect. We provide a variety of services for refugees, asylum seekers, asylees, victims of trafficking, and other vulnerable immigrants in the United States. That's what we do domestically. We also have an international wing of our organization as well. So IRC serves over 35,000 individuals with an array of services aimed at helping them survive, reclaim control of their futures, and strengthen their communities in the U.S. IRC measures their progress on this mission by assessing improvements in the long-term outcomes for women, men, girls, boys, and all of our clients. And these measurements are health and safety, education, economic well-being, and an economic empowerment. And IRC wants to achieve our goal while we deliver the greatest amount of impact with the most amount of people at the lowest amount of costs. And we're committed to constantly strengthening the effectiveness of our programs and the responsiveness to our clients and our communities, and reach a more timely and evidence-based assistance for our clients. So our programs include domestically, not just refugee resettlement, although that is a large part of what we do, but we also have an economic empowerment program, which teaches financial literacy and how to open potentially a small business in the United States. We also have our health, safety, and well-being, which will assess the physical health and the mental health of the clients, because that is also very important. We provide food security and agriculture. I know Islamic Relief also is a large food security program as well. We also provide immigration and citizenship services. This is mainly for asylum seekers that are coming through the southern border. We have youth services as well as anti-trafficking. And then we use our monitoring and evaluation program to assess all of these programs and their incomes and their indicators, outcomes and indicators. And then funding from all of these programs come from a variety of resources. I think there's a misconception that all of this funding comes from federal funds, which is not true. A lot of the federal funds are not enough to run these programs. So we supplement them with state and local grants, as well as private donors. Private donors make a large part of what we do. And it could be anybody from, like, let's say a celebrity to even ourselves across the screen. And our programming is designed to help newcomers adjust to their new surroundings, but also become economically self-sufficient. As we know in America, our asylum system and our refugee system is different than our counterparts overseas. So economic self-sufficiency is very important, as well as mental and physical health conditions when they arrive.
Great. Thank you, Parissa. A common thread throughout this discussion has been human trafficking. And even despite in advanced nations like the US, we see at alarming levels. If you look right now in New York, those who have migrated here are experiencing issues of human trafficking. Why do we see this trend happening? What would you say to that?
So I can give you my personal opinion on human trafficking. So oftentimes it is a heavily political issue as well. Whereas when you see a reduction in a refugee pipeline, you will often see an increase in an asylum pipeline at the southern border. Because as many of us know, it doesn't stop laws that deter asylum or refugee resettlement don't necessarily deter a person from coming. They just deter the means of which a person will come. So if someone cannot get into the United States through legal means such as resettlement, they might fly and go to the southern border into a, what the international community would consider a safe third country. It might not be safe for them. And as a result, there's trafficking concerns. There's anywhere between 700,000 to 4 million persons that are trafficked worldwide currently. People are often susceptible to the circumstances that are targeted by traffickers who exploit their vulnerability, need, and other situations. Some victims are promised employment, education, or other opportunities for a better life. And some are just exploited within their relationships, while others are experiencing a different exploitative situation. People who experience trafficking come from a diverse demographic, cultural, and linguistic background. So there is no this person is more likely to be trafficked than this person. And it's usually done, it focuses around what is happening in the history of the country, and also the means of getting safe passage into a safe third country. And trafficking link networks, as mentioned previously by my colleagues, can be linked to criminal activities such as kidnapping, extortion, racketeering, foreign corrupt practices, production of counterfeit goods, prostitution, drug trafficking, money laundering, and the list goes on. So again, if we are not creating a safe passage for them to be able to come here, you might see them try to create their own path, and that sometimes causes them to be trafficked.
Thank you, Parissa. Countries that have, introduced or enacted third country laws or bans have often made the argument that, those that are trying to enter their country, they don't have the capacity to host them. Do you see this as a legitimate issue? What are your thoughts to that?
I mean, I think there is deterrence that oftentimes countries will use. And there's deterrence for the client as well. The client might find it unsafe passage to come because a safe third country is not necessarily safe for them to be able to stay and provide out-country processing there. I think the solution is actually multifold. So one, you have to create additional safe humanitarian and employment pathways in the third country so they can reach things like citizenship, residency. If they don't have any means, for example, if you're a migrant and you don't have a way of, getting asylum because you don't have those 5 rounds of asylum, you don't have a claim for that. What other pathway is there for you to be able to come here safely, etc.? We need to open the pathways. That probably requires a reform of the Immigration and Nationality Act or policies, executive orders, etc. There's also has to be a global sustainable movement for the safety and security through policies focused on conflict resolution and environmental stability. And I say this because we see this alarming new rate of what we call, it's a misnomer, but they're called climate refugees. They don't necessarily fall under those 5 enumerated grounds. However, they still have to flee due to environmental situations out of their control. What are we going to do with that population once, they hit critical mass? We don't have solutions for them yet. We also have to ensure, and this goes kind of back to what Dr. Takriti was saying, that we have to ensure international human rights laws are complied with by all member states. Member states have to hold each other accountable. If we have human rights laws and we're not following them, then what is the point of having them? And what is the point of non-governmental entities such as the UN, et cetera? And then we have to invest in social services programs to help newcomers integrate and become self-sufficient. For refugees, there is a lot of post-arrival services, but there aren't for asylum seekers. Unfortunately, asylum seekers, the only benefit they really have until they have their hearing and find out the resolution of their asylum claim is an EAD. There are some organizations that employment authorization documents, there are some organizations that provide wraparound services for clients in the United States, but they don't have a safety net here while they're waiting. And as Aaliyah pointed out before, it could be 6-7 years. Imagine 6-7 years in a country and all you have is employment authorization. It's hard.
Thank you, Professor. I would be remiss not to talk about the deadly situation in Haiti at this time. Anna, the U.S. and global media continue to report on the extreme deterioration of public security and acute human suffering in Haiti. How is UNHCR responding to the situation?
Thank you, Mohammed. Yes, the situation in Haiti in the last year and a half has deteriorated to the extent where UNHCR now believes that virtually all Haitians, should they cross into another country by land or sea, should be considered refugees. We are not present inside Haiti except 2 local staff. We do not have a mandate to manage the IDP crisis, the internally displaced persons crisis there. But we do focus on Haitians who flee wherever they may be, whether it's in a neighboring country or whether they've reached the French territories in the Southern Caribbean or whether they've reached Brazil or Chile or the United States, including those who are intercepted at sea. And just this past week, in fact, we issued new international protection guidance on Haitians. This is something that we do globally, particularly when there are acute protection needs amongst a particular population. We basically issued guidelines calling on states to not return Haitians to their country. That call has actually been out now for over a year. However, we went beyond that to encourage all states who are receiving Haitians. Of course, the vast majority who are arriving to countries in the Western Hemisphere, to not only ensure that Haitians have access to an asylum procedure, applying that 1951 Refugee Convention definition that Cynthia explained in detail, but also to consider Haitians as refugees under the expanded refugee definition, which exists in Latin America, and also there is a similar definition at play in Africa. And that really is an expanded definition which considers that anyone, there's no persecution requirement, but anyone who faces a serious threat to their life, their physical integrity, or their freedom resulting from generalized violence or massive violations of human rights or events seriously disturbing public order, that these people should not be sent back to harm, even if they were not found to meet the persecution and the nexus requirements of the 51 Convention. It is rare that UNHCR calls on states around the world to provide blanket protections like this for all those leaving. There are, of course, exceptions. If someone is themselves a persecutor or a human rights violator, or someone who's committed serious crimes, for example, they would not benefit from this refugee protection. But civilians, innocent people who have faced these types of serious harms should be protected. And what UNHCR normally calls for in these situations is that even if states' own laws or their own adjudicatory frameworks do not allow them to recognize each individual after determination, that at a minimum, states provide temporary protection and do not wholesale return people back to dangers. The situation in Haiti is absolutely acute right now. And so it's a little, the way it plays out operationally is a little bit different, of course, because they only have a land border with one other small country on which they share an island. But it is really incumbent upon the world to be paying attention right now to what's happening in Haiti, because it's really reached, essentially, the point of no return for Haitian civilians. Back to you.
Thank you, Anna. We're almost out of time, so we're going to wrap up with potentially two questions here. One of them coming from the audience, which states, what are your thoughts on children, migration, and asylum seekers to have to represent themselves in asylum cases because it's a civil state and they don't have equal rights? So I'll leave it open to the floor. I think that's from some of our legal scholars, but I'll let any of you go ahead and take a shot at it.
I can kind of take a shot at answering that question. So as far as from the legal perspective, and I apologize, my internet just went out, so I had to get on a different network. But anyways, as far as the perspective for children having to represent themselves, for at least personally, what I see is that the courts really try to make sure that immigrants have representation, whether that's through a nonprofit organization, whether it's through themselves gaining representation through, private practice or funding. It's really, they try to make sure that anyone, not just children, have representation. I've had personally clients come to me themselves and say the judge gave me one last chance to get an attorney. I even have had children come to me and see if I'd be able to help them. And, children, we mean people who are under 18. But yes, there are children that sometimes are forced to quote unquote represent themselves. But I would say that the effort really is to not make that happen. The United States does have programs for minor children who enter the United States unaccompanied. Often they could be entered into the foster system. They're offered, there's a special visa called a visa for special immigrant. It's special immigrant juvenile status. So, minor children who do not have the custody or have been abandoned, abused, neglected by one of their parents or both of their parents can seek that. And if they are granted that visa, they're eligible to apply for a green card. So, as far as children having to represent themselves, I can't say that this is like a common problem. I believe it's something that is trying to be addressed, and they try to prevent children to represent themselves. Like, oh yes, Parisa mentioned Kind. There's several nonprofit organizations who will support, and I believe, you know, when children come in, they get placed into ORR, so they are given some support, and generally they don't have to represent themselves.
Mohammed, I could just add to one element to that.
Sure.
You know, the U.S. receives a higher volume of unaccompanied children on its territory than any other country in the world. And like Alia was saying, there is a fairly sophisticated operational and legal framework to receive children. And I would just say that one really positive development in this space recently is that the immigration courts nationwide are now introducing children's dockets that will have judges that are specialized in child-friendly proceedings. And so while it is really critical that children have an attorney, I do think that in a country that does not guarantee free legal representation for all asylum seekers and not all children either, there have been some attempts to try to create an environment where children are more easily heard by judges that are really specially trained in this. So that the children's dockets piece is important. It's not just whether you have a lawyer, but how child-friendly that procedure is. Back to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think Parisa, you alluded to this earlier. We're ready to close out here in a moment. After this comment I want to share, but if there are any additional thoughts you want to share to this or anyone else on the floor, that would be great. Europe doesn't have a problem absorbing immigrants. They were fine accepting Ukrainian refugees. What are your thoughts to that? And Parisa or anyone else who would be interested.
On Ukrainian refugees or on Ukrainian?
Ukrainian. So the question or comment appears to be about, you know, Europe accepting immigrants and accepting refugees. It goes back to the issue that I had shared earlier, that there's an idea that there's an exceeding capacity of for countries to accept immigrants, refugees. But however, as this comment is stating, Europe, other parts of Europe were fine welcoming Ukrainian refugees across the region.
So I think a lot of that has to do also with the way that Europe categorizes a refugee versus an asylee. So we make a distinction here, although the enumerated grounds are the same. In Europe, they do not make that distinction. So their numbers might be higher in terms of accepting, but the way that we look at it is there's generally two pipelines with the 5 enumerated grounds. There's the asylee pipeline, and technically they're processed stateside, and then there's the refugee pipeline. The claim is the same, it's just refugees are processed overseas, and then they come in on a valid status, whereas asylees, they have to seek that valid status domestically, even though we have out-country processing. So I think the numbers would be generally the same if we looked at it from that perspective. I do think that obviously with executive orders, there is a chance to increase the amount that we take in. And especially on the refugee side, I was kind of like addressing the previous question as well, is there is refugee programs for unaccompanied minors. For example, it'll allow them to process overseas and then come here where they're avoiding that unsafe passage potentially through a third safe country. However, does their host country have the ability to host them while they're waiting to process? That's a different question. So yes, we do have Ukrainian programs on the refugee side. Ukrainian parolees can receive benefits, but I think a lot of it has to do with semantics more than anything. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to that, because we do make a distinction in the US. I don't think a lot of other countries do in terms of, and that will help people assess what type of benefits that they can get stateside.
May I add a point to that?
Yes, please.
Just as an overall point, so not so much the intricacies of the law, but more about the overall picture is and I'm sure the panelists remember this, about 3 months before the beginning of the Ukrainian war, there was a number of refugees, or actually mixed migrants, I suppose would be the correct term, trying to get from mostly Iraqi Kurdistan to Poland via Belarus. And they were repulsed with water cannon and riot gear and all of this. And we were only seeing about, it was in the hundreds at most, you know, several dozen, a few hundred people trying to get into Poland. And right after that, there was then a tidal wave of Ukrainians fleeing, and they were not only accepted, they were warmly welcomed by Europe as a whole. So there is a difference there. And yes, there is a bureaucratic explanation for that, but there's also a political and cultural explanation of that. And one other point before I turn the floor back is that in 2015, if I remember correctly, it was something like a tidal wave, if you will, of 5 million refugees coming mostly from Turkey and the Aegean, mostly from Syria, but also from other locations. And now looking back on it, not quite a decade later, as I understand it, they're integrating reasonably well, mostly in Germany. So I would agree with the opinion of the one who posted the comment that Europe is capable of doing more and has done more, even in the recent past.
Not to extend too much, but I think there were some similar concerns about how the U.S. treated Haitians at the border versus other types of people at the border. And I think, you know, there's always those concerns that there may be favorites or not favorites in that immigration process.
Thank you, Cynthia.
For another panel.
Thank you, Cynthia. Last but not least, and I've heard some of this alluded by some of you, by some of our special guests here, but from a personal or faith perspective, what has inspired and continue to give you hope in continuing this challenging and sensitive work? What is your why? And I hope everyone around the room can share their inspiration, whether that be from a faith or non-faith-based perspective, given the challenges, the heartbreak, the struggle, the complexities. You know, everyone at this time, it's as we look across the world at what's going on in Palestine, across the Middle East, Ukraine, Haiti, Sudan, Ethiopia, Africa, everywhere. What can you offer? What inspires you, faith or non-faith? What gives you hope? And why? What inspires you to continue this work?
If I may, I guess I'll go first, unless you'd rather another go first. I'll say this. When I was growing up, my father was an Iraqi immigrant to the U.S., and my mother was from a longstanding military family, completely, as to use the local argot, WASP, even redneck. And that combination, growing up in New Orleans, I was actually quite provincial at the same time. And then as I went out in the world throughout my career, I gradually became much more in tune with what was going on in the rest of the world. And now, all these years later, I'm seeing my daughters at the local public high school in Virginia, in the DC suburbs, and I'm seeing the children of immigrants, and in some cases, immigrants themselves, perform extremely well in the public school system, and in fact outperform most of those who are not from an immigrant background in the school system. And how they got here is a different case in every case, but it provides optimism for me, and I think I'll just leave it at that for myself.
Thank you. Aaliyah?
Yes, I can speak. I think that, I think in order to be, in this type of practice, at least for me, I practice immigration, or anyone who works in any type of humanitarian work, you have to have some compassion, which can be religiously based. It can also be just based on your own moral compass. And I think for me, having compassion for my clients, feeling that I want them to be able to do better in their life and find resolutions to their difficult, situations. Yes, my faith does have play part in how I treat my clients, how I perform my work, and in the work that I do. But I also think just being a human being is something that is important in having compassion for the people who are coming here seeking asylum. It's not easy. People think that coming across the border and then, just coming here, it is a long journey that many times can take months, if not sometimes years. And they go through very difficult hardships to come here. So why would a person go through that or put themselves through that unless they were forced to do so because of their circumstance? And I think we have to kind of take that into consideration.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Anna?
I can perhaps go next. I have my own personal story of growing up and supporting refugee families within my own family structure growing up, and that's what drew me to the work. But I think what's kept me in the work for so long, including working in the UN system, is really the notion that the refugee regime is part of what keeps our globe more secure. We have so much so many people are living in so much great distress and insecurity. But the global system really does rely on states helping other states to respond appropriately when refugees need help. And without this system, I do think that we would be a much more dangerous planet and a much less stable place than we already are. So I'm really driven by the notion that this treaty-based system is not just critical, according to our moral compass and our sense of compassion and our need to help people who are suffering, but it really is a source of some degree of stability in the world.
Thank you, Anna. Parisa?
Sure. I mean, I echo what everybody says, but mainly when I see everybody on the panel, it kind of proves that it's a system, while complicated and yes, sometimes not the best, it's working. We're multicultural societies. We are able to assess every aspect of the human condition and improve it, and we will continue to do so. What we do is probably not going to be highlighted on the media or anything like that. But when I see people that are on the ground actually doing the work, it reminds me consistently about why we're doing it. We oftentimes come from the background where our families had to flee, or let's say our families had to move because of a specific reason. And we integrated, and we can show that multiculturalism does work. This is our notion of what human rights means. And yes, it might not be highlighted. Again, the news is not going to highlight the good parts of humanity, but it exists. It's a constant reminder it exists. And I work with it on a day-to-day basis. So it doesn't matter, what kind of disparity is happening. As long as we all are around and I see you all, I know we're subtly, we're making these changes. I call it very stealthily. We do it quietly because politically sometimes that's what you have to do, but it's getting done. The good people's work is getting done. So that's my conclusion.
Thank you, Parisa. Cynthia?
Thank you. Great question. I come from a family of immigrants, and I see how much my parents' struggle and hard work make this a better country. And in addition, I feel that by the fortune of my birth, I'm privileged to grow up in a free society that's relatively free from the problems that I see that these people are fleeing from. And I feel a duty to give back, to help those that are less fortunate than I am, that my privilege is not one to hoard, but rather to share. So in large part, I do think that's partially due to how I was raised in the faith that I adhere to.
Thank you, Cynthia. To close, reflecting on the scripture that's within the foundation and that guides Islamic Relief USA, I'm reminded by the words of where God Almighty tells us He will never change a condition of a people until they change what's within themselves. And oftentimes we are too wrapped up in what's going on within our bubble. And I believe that to change the condition, we have to see the humanity and others across the world. And again, the scripture tells us, God Almighty says, all humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female and made you into peoples and tribes so that you can get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous among you. God is truly all-knowing, all-aware. And with that, I thank you all for your time today, for joining us, bearing patience with some of our technical difficulties. But as you can see, we have an excellent panel with us today of special guests who were equipped to take on the refugee work and this difficult space, navigating through some of these technical challenges. So thank you for your patience and all that you guys, with all that you all brought to the table today. I want to thank the audience. I want to again give a special thanks to our friends at the Interfaith G20, US for UNHCR, and Islamic Relief USA for sponsoring and supporting this great program. Until the next time, I say to you with the greetings of Islamic Relief USA, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, be safe, God bless, and see you soon.